This program is proudly brought to you by Telecom Limited and Daytech.
Mr. Barker, thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Malcolm.
Firstly, the key driver of government policy is the budget, as we all know. The CIMC has just concluded the budget workshop a few weeks ago. Can you tell us about the workshop and some of its key takeaway points?
This was a national forum, and it followed on from 4 regional forums on the theme of opening up the budget. So as you said, the budget is the key financial event and policy-making event, but also legislative event of the year for the government in relation to the economy and in relation to managing the fiscal side, which is income and expenditure of the government. That happens once a year, usually in November, sometimes slips to December. I think it's probably scheduled this year for that session starting on the 26th of November. What occurred in those forums, it was an opportunity to open up the budget process, raising awareness of the whole budget cycle to the public. And there were 4 regional forums that occurred in Kimbe, Alatau, Hagen, Vanimo, as well as the National Forum in Port Moresby. And so it was, as I say, to raise awareness. And one of the things that is known from research around the world is where the public is aware, is engaged, participates in the budget process, then you tend to get better outcomes. If it's all done behind closed doors and the public doesn't know what's there, but also that Parliament is not really fully involved, if it's just prescribed, then you tend to get worse budget outcomes. Governments then just prioritize what they want to spend the money on, and then they don't account for the money afterwards. So every 2 years, the Institute of National Affairs conducts a survey called the Open Budget Survey, which is based in 125 countries now around the world, and it looks at the openness of the budget process. It's not looking at whether the budget is a great budget or not such a good budget. It's just looking at the openness, whether the documentation is available in a timely manner for the budget preparation, the budget that is tabled in Parliament, and then the budget being implemented subsequently, and then accounting for the budget afterwards, notably through the audit. So PNG comes somewhere in the middle ranks, providing inadequate budget information, but it's certainly somewhat better than quite a number of other countries around the world. It's certainly not in the higher categories which provide a lot of information, but it provides some, but still inadequate. But then that is tabled in Parliament, but then afterwards we're not very good at either applying the budget as it's been approved by Parliament, but also we're not very good at keeping the public, but even Parliament, up to date with how the money is actually being spent. And we tend not to spend it properly in accordance with what the budget that has been approved has required. So there's a lot of shifting of funds between different categories during the year without resorting to Parliament to approve that process, but just moving it from one item to another. And I think during this year there's a lot of concern. The government states that there's not a budget problem and that there's not a cash flow problem, and yet every government institution that one talks to are saying that they're having major problems, cash flow problems. They are not getting the funds in the first half of the year. They're not getting it in a timely manner for and probably they're not getting it at all for the projects. So it may cover the salaries in the end. So where is the money going? That's a big question, and that's why you need the in-year budget accounting and providing of the information through the mid-year economic fiscal outlook report, but also through other mid-year reports going through the different quarters. Now we're just into October. We haven't yet seen the mid-year economic and fiscal outlook report, which is meant to be out at the end of July. But now we're a couple of months further down, so we don't actually know where the money has been going. And now we're just on the point where we should actually be releasing the pre-budget statement for 2025, leading into the actual budget presentation next month. So accountability of the funds, and then further down the cycle, you have the actual auditing, and we don't actually have the audits released to the public for the budget expenditure since 2018, so that's 6 years ago. So we don't know how the money has been spent, and as auditing is meant to be a tool where you look at the budget, has it been spent properly? Has the money all been accounted for? Has it been spent in accordance with what is required in the budget to achieve the policy objectives? Well, 6 years after the event, and you haven't actually got the audits of the total budget, it's difficult to hold anyone to account, because in the last 6 years, many departmental heads have changed. Most ministers have changed several times. So you can't actually go and hold anyone to account. But that is part of the documentation that is needed. And so it requires public participation, but it also needs the legislature, which is Parliament, to be involved not just in just approving the budget in a parliamentary session, but they really should be seeing and engaging in the discussion about the budget prior to the budget. And then during the course of the year, a parliamentary committee should be reviewing budget process, and the parliamentary permanent committee on accounts, public accounts committee, should also be then reviewing the previous year's budget expenditure, the reports that are provided by the Auditor General, and asking questions of the departmental head, maybe of the minister, on why there are, failings or, issues to do with the budget. That's all part of the process. So it's engaging the public, because these are public funds. Sometimes they're borrowed funds, but they still become public funds because you're borrowing, and the public is expected to repay the public, including the business sector, through their taxes. So as a citizen and as a taxpayer, you have a right, and as a recipient of public services, you have a right to know what your government is actually allocating its funds to, and how it's actually spending those funds, and whether it's consistent. So the public should be involved in the prioritization, in the preparation process, so there should be a consultation process, and then whether the money is actually being spent in accordance with those agreed priorities and the budget, or whether it's being diverted to something that's completely different, which is a major concern.
Another alarming trend currently is the decline in the value of the PNG kina. How has this affected the PNG economy based on your assessment?
Well, the reason why the kina has been weakening is partly because of the government effectively overexpending and having to borrow, and so and then having to service those debts. So the priority for expenditure is often paying for repaying loans, but it's also for paying the interest on those loans constantly, and that squeezes out the private sector that needs access to foreign exchange. So the economy, if it's not bringing in enough foreign exchange, if you're not getting adequate investment by private investors into the economy, then the value of the kina tends to weaken. But PNG is really strange because, in fact, PNG exports far more than it imports in most years. So it's a major producer of gas converted into LNG. It's a major producer of gold. It's a producer of copper, nickel, agricultural crops like palm oil, coffee, cocoa, spices and other things. So it's exporting far more than the value of what it's importing. Yes, we import a lot of manufactured goods, four-wheel drives, outboard motors, processed foods, but also some other products. Most manufactured products are being imported. But nevertheless, the exports of the raw materials and semi-processed goods, agricultural minerals, etc., is far greater than the value of what we're importing. But it's not coming back in because a lot of those businesses have overseas accounts and they export and then they hold the funds offshore, or they have major overseas debts, so they're having to pay off their debts for a major new resource project. Now, most of those resource projects are pretty mature. Even the LNG is 10 years old. It's paid off a lot of its debt. So it's now more money is coming into the country, into the government, and being brought on shore. But the thing is that the resource companies are allowed to have these offshore accounts for various reasons. And companies don't really want to bring the money into PNG and into kina because they think and they hear that the kina is overvalued, and they know it's difficult to take money out when they need it. So they prefer to keep it outside the country, because then if they need some money, they need some US dollars, they've already got it. So they can pay whatever they have to pay, whether it's for imported goods or to pay dividends or whatever. So they try to keep the money offshore. Now, there are rules that they're meant to bring it back into the country, but as I say, resource companies and various companies are allowed to have under their project agreements. So these are things that government needs to review, but it has to do it in a way that is not going to put off investment unduly, because if you put all kinds of restrictions and then you say, well, you're going to have a problem taking the money out of the country, then the companies will say, fine, we'll invest somewhere else where we can move money in and out when we like.
Thank you, Mr. Barker. We now go for a quick break. Join us on the other side for more discussions. Welcome back. You're watching Infocus. Now, Mr. Barker, the government has just announced the minimum wage board review, which is happening after 10 years. What would you like to see captured in this review?
Okay, well, you highlighted earlier the exchange rate. The exchange rate and inflation are factors that affect basically your cost of living. And of course, as your exchange rate weakens against foreign currencies, then all the imported goods rise, so it has an inflationary effect. And then you have imported inflation, which comes, for example, after the Ukraine war. The invasion occurred, it pushed the oil prices up. Everything is dependent a bit on oil and energy. And so if you're transporting goods and services, it pushes up the prices, and that pushes up the prices to commercial operators as well as to the final consumer. So your cost of living is pushed up from external sources. Your domestic inflation happens when you haven't got enough factors of production. And so, for example, if you haven't got enough housing, if you haven't got enough land available for housing, then that pushes up the rentals. Those who are the landlords, take advantage of the situation with a limited supply. So the market finds a higher level of price. And again, if you're a consumer, you're renting your property, you'll find the prices go up. One of the other factors you'll see just lately, in fact, the latest 6-monthly monetary report from the central bank highlighted that actually in the June quarter, or the June month, inflation level went to a record low level. But that actually was because the price of buoy had come down. So if you removed buoy from the CPI index and said the costs of goods and services that are recorded excluding buoy, it was something like 3.1%. So if you're not a buoy consumer, you would have found that the cost of living was still going up. But if you're a big buoy consumer, then you suddenly find that your life is a little cheaper. So the CPI, Consumer Price Index, is based on a variety of goods and services that the ordinary consumers in PNG are using on a routine basis. So staple foods and services and so on. So the last minimum wage hearings were, and determination was way back in 2014. So that's 10 years ago. It introduced a new minimum wage and an adjustment that came in 2 years later. So 2016 was the last one. And so since then, it has remained fixed at that level. Of course, that doesn't mean that all wages are at that level. A lot of those wages are determined by the market. And if you are a plumber and there are no plumbers available, you can set your price and you'll find that your wages will have risen according to the market conditions. If you've got a big surplus of people who are offering the services that you're able to provide and with the skills that you have, then it tends to have a downward effect. So the minimum wage provides a protection level. But we also know that the informal economy, of course, is not determined by minimum wages, although some are on very low levels in the informal economy. Some are actually making good money in the informal economy. So, there's a big range there. And so what is happening in the informal economy has a major influence on the wage levels in the formal economy. Because if you're a formal sector employer and you're offering wages that are going to be less than the person can earn in the informal economy, maybe running his own informal business or family business, then he's going to remain informal. So the formal economy is partly determined by what's happening in the informal economy, as well as what is happening with other companies and employers in the formal. But you also have a segment we sometimes call the unregulated sector. So they are sort of meant to be in the formal economy. They're businesses, some of them are overseas-owned businesses. They're really meant to be formal. They're meant to be registered. Many of them may be registered, but they're ignoring various laws of the land, and they're not paying minimum wages. And they are getting away with it because, partly no one's inspecting, or maybe they can pay off people to ignore, but also because there's a surplus of supply. So many of them may be retailing. They may have trade stores of some sort, and they know they can employ often young women at below the minimum wages. And because those women want the income, they don't go and complain, but they couldn't live on that money. They only can live on that money because they're usually living in the household, they're living in the family house, in the settlement, or in the peri-urban area, or the family house. So it's just like a bonus. It contributes to their cost of living, but they're actually being paid less than the minimum wage. So that is an issue. So many years ago, it was felt that actually we should get away from the minimum wages system, and used the national tripartite system where the government, private sector, civil society come along, private sector business, they come along with the Employers Federation and negotiate what should be suitable wage systems and levels in different industries, trades unions being part of that. But they do have their meetings. They don't have them very often, and there is a case to say, yeah, you still need that bottom threshold. There used to be more than one minimum wage. They'd have a rural minimum wage and an urban minimum wage. It's certainly when they started setting an urban wage, that isn't a wage that is competitive in the rural areas. So they started setting a wage, but then they allowed companies on the basis of capacity to pay to be exempted. So some agricultural businesses said, look, we employ lots of people, but the cost of living in the rural areas is lower than in the urban areas, but we also cannot pay those urban wages. We can't provide housing, we can't provide salaries at that level, and the system and the Labour Department allowed them to have a lower threshold to be exempted from that. But as I say, there are many other enterprises that are just still ignoring even the minimum wage from 10 years ago. But as we know, since 2014, cost of living has gone up substantially, and particularly in urban areas, and you saw it during the COVID period, cost of inflation really rose, particularly at the end of the COVID period. And since the end of 2021, inflation from then till about through 2022 really pushed up the costs. So particularly in the urban areas where you can't produce your own food from your own gardens, you're dependent on food bought from the rural areas and imported food.
Thank you, Mr. Barker. We now go for a quick break. Join us on the other side for more discussions. Welcome back. You're watching Infocus. Still in the studio with me is Mr. Paul Barker. Mr. Barker, unemployment is currently a major concern in the country. Which sectors do you think the government should be targeting to create the greatest number of employment over the short period of time?
Well, agriculture is still the major employer in PNG. You have significant employment, formal sector employment in the public service, but of course that's all funded from tax revenue, and it's funded from the revenue that is gained from the private sector and from household wages and tax payments. So when we say high levels of unemployment, in fact, most of the population is employed, except for those people who are studying or people who are too young or too old. Most people are employed, but most people are employed in the informal economy. And so in the informal economy, there can be people who are earning quite good amounts and many people who are employed very much part-time. So you have high levels of underemployment. And as we know, you've had a big youth bulge across the country, lots of young people coming in. The schools can't cater for them, so there are not enough places in the in high schools and secondary schools, and not enough places in tertiary institutions to absorb them all. There's not enough catering for the sort of basic needs that they need from an education system to empower them in the informal and in the formal sector. But you have this large youth bulge. The formal sector has not grown really over the years since independence adequately. But then particularly since over the last 10 years, it has not grown substantially. There were a bit of growth around the time of construction of the LNG operation. And then once it came into production, we've not seen any large growths in the formal sector occurring. There have been a lot of major resource projects that have been promised and planned, but haven't really materialized. Some smaller ones, K92 mining, that have kicked off during that last 10 years. But by and large, we haven't seen the big resource projects. But it should be recognized that the big resource projects like LNG, yes, there are plans for Papua LNG and Penyang in Western Province. For a 3-4 year period, they employ a lot of people, particularly people with certain skills, welders, truck drivers, boat operators, electricians, and so on. But at the end of the 3 year period, those are high-tech projects. In the fullness of time, they will employ a small number of high-tech people, like computer operators and so on. They employ a certain number of people in less high-tech jobs like security guards, but they do not employ a lot of people because they're pretty automated. They provide a resource flow in the fullness of time once they've paid off their debts in taxation to the government. So that enables the government to invest in infrastructure, roads, schools, health services, and so on. But their primary function is not directly generating jobs. There are construction and contractors. The miners, as opposed to LNG, create more jobs. So when Porgera closed down, 3,600 jobs effectively disappeared. A few people stayed on for mothball maintenance. But you lost them, you lost the contractors. Thousands of people contracted in trucking and supply, including informal economy, people who are providing food supplies through to the mine workers and so on. So there were literally some, 10,000 or so people who effectively lost their employment. So mining creates more jobs, but even high-tech jobs, high-tech mines like the potential Wafi Golpu, big construction phase, but it's a very deep and high-tech mining operation. As a result of that, it's mostly computerized, automated equipment, so you're talking about some high-tech skills, but it's not going to directly generate so many jobs once construction has occurred.
Well, viewers, that concludes this edition of Infocus. Do join us again next week, Monday, for another episode of Infocus. Till then, bye for now.